Hi, it's bedtime again. So we're ready for another story? Wonderful. You settle down, close your eyes and listen while I read The Blue Parrot. In part of Arabia, where groves of palms and sweet-scented flowers give the traveller rest after toilsome journeys under burning skies, there reigned a young king whose name was Lino. He had grown up under the wise rule of his father, who had lately died, and though he was only 19, he did not believe, like many young men, that he must change all the laws in order to show how clever he was, but was content with the old ones, which had made the people happy and the country prosperous. There was only one fault that his subjects had to find with him, and that was he did not seem in any hurry to be married, in spite of all the prayers that they frequently offered him. The neighbouring kingdom was governed by the Swan Fairy, who had an only daughter, the Princess Hermosa, who was as charming in her way as Lino in his. The Swan Fairy always had an ambassador at the young king's court, and on hearing the grumbles of the citizens that Lino showed no signs of taking a wife, the good man resolved that he would try his hand at matchmaking. For, he said, if there is anyone living who is worthy of the Prince Hermosa, he is to be found here. At any rate, I can but try to bring them together. Now, of course, it was not proper to offer the princess in marriage, and the difficulty was to work upon the unconscious king so as to get the proposal to come from him. But the ambassador was well used to the ways of court, and after several conversations on the art of painting, which Lino loved, he led the talk to portraits, and mentioned carelessly that a particularly fine portrait had lately been made of his own princess. Though as for a likeness, he concluded, perhaps it is hardly as good as this small miniature which was painted a year ago. The king took it and looked at it closely. Ah, he sighed, that must be flattered. It cannot be possible that any woman should be such a miracle of beauty. If you could only see her, answered the ambassador. The king did not reply, but the ambassador was not at all surprised when, the following morning, he was sent for into the royal presence. Since you showed me that picture, began Lino, almost before the door was shut, I have not been able to banish the face of the princess from my thoughts. I have summoned you here to inform you that I am about to send special envoys to the court of the Swan Fairy, asking her daughter in marriage. I cannot, as you will understand, speak for my mistress in so important a matter, replied the ambassador, stroking his beard in order to conceal the satisfaction he felt. But I know that she will certainly be highly gratified at your proposal. If that is so, cried the king, his whole face beaming in joy, then, instead of sending envoys, I will go myself, and take you with me. In 3 days my preparations will be made, and we will set out. Unluckily for Lino, he had for his neighbour on the other side a powerful magician named Ismenor, who was the king of the Isle of Lions, and father of a hideous daughter, whom he thought the most beautiful creature that ever existed. Riquette, for such was her name, had also fallen in love with the portrait, but it was of King Lino, and she implored her father to give him to her as her husband. Ismenor, who considered that no man lived who was worthy of his treasure, was about to send his chief minister to King Lino on this mission, when the news reached him that the king had already started for the court of the Swan Fairy. Riquette was thrown into transports of grief, and implored her father to prevent the marriage, which Ismenor promised to do, and called for an ugly and humpbacked little dwarf named Raybot. He performed some spells which transported them quickly to a rocky valley through which the king and his escort were bound to pass. When the tramp of horses was heard, the magician took out an enchanted handkerchief which rendered invisible anyone who touched it. Giving one end to Raybot and holding the other himself, they walked unseen among the horsemen, but not a trace of Lino was to be found, and this was natural enough, because the king, tired out of the excitement and fatigue of the last few days, had bidden the heavy coaches laden with presents for the princess to go forward, while he rested under the palms with a few of his friends. Here Ismenor beheld them all sound asleep, and casting a spell which prevented their waking till he wished them to do so, he stripped the king of all his clothes and dressed him in those of Raybot, whom he touched with his ring, saying, "Take the shape of Lino until you have wedded the daughter of the Swan Fairy." So great was the magician's power that Raybot positively believed himself really to be the king. When the groom had mounted Lino's horse and had ridden out of sight, Ismenor aroused the king and started with astonishment at the dirty garments into which he was dressed. But before he had time to look about him, the magician caught him up in a cloud and carried him off to his daughter. Meanwhile Raybot had come up with the others, who never guessed for a moment that he was not their master. "I am hungry," said he. "Give me something to eat at once." "May it please your majesty," answered the steward, "the tents are not even set up, and it will be at least an hour before your supper is served. We thought—" "Who taught you to think?" interrupted the false king rudely. "You are nothing but a fool. Get me some horse's flesh directly. It is the best meat in the world." The steward could hardly believe his ears. King Lino, the most polite man under the sun, to speak to his faithful servant in such a manner, and to want horse's flesh too. Why, he was so delicate in his appetite that he lived mostly on fruit and cakes. Well, there is no knowing what some people could come to, and anyhow he must obey at once if he wished to keep his head on his shoulders. Perhaps, after all, it was love which had driven him mad, and, if so, by and by, he might come right again. Whatever excuses his old servants might invent for their master, by the time the procession reached the Swan Fairy's capital, there was no more horses left, and they were forced to walk up to the palace on foot. Hiding their surprise as best they could, they begged the king to follow them, dismounting from their own horses as he, they suppose, preferred to walk. They soon perceived the Swan Fairy and her daughter awaiting them on a balcony, under which the king stopped. "Madam," he said, "you may be surprised that I have come to ask your daughter's hand in so unceremonious a fashion, but the journey is long, and I was hungry and ate my horse, which is the best meat in the world, and I forced my courtiers to eat theirs also. But for all that, I am a great king, and wish to be your son-in-law. Now that is settled, where is Hermosa?" "Sire," answered the queen, not a little displeased, as well as amazed at the king's manner, which was so different from anything she had been led to expect, "you possess my daughter's portrait, and it can have made but little impression on you if you do not recognize her at once." "I don't remember any portrait," replied Raybot, "but perhaps it may be in my pocket after all." And he searched everywhere, while the ladies in waiting looked on with astonishment, but of course found nothing. When he finished, he turned to the princess, who stood there blushing and angry, and said, "If it is you whom I have come to marry, I think you are very beautiful, and I am sure, if I have ever seen your portrait, I should have remembered it. Let us have the wedding as soon as possible, and meantime I should like to go to sleep, for your country is very different from mine, and I can assure you that after walking over stones and sands for days and days, one needs a little rest." Without waiting for a reply, he bade one of the pages conduct him to his room, where he was soon snoring so loudly that he could be heard over the other end of the town. As soon as he was out of their sight, the poor princess flung herself into her mother's arms and burst into tears. For 15 days she had had King Lino's portrait constantly before her, while a letter from their own ambassador, speaking of the young man's grace and charm, had never left her pocket. True, the portrait was faithful enough, but how could that fair outside contain so rough a rude soul? Yet this even she might have forgiven, had the king shown any signs of love and admiration to which she had been so long accustomed. As for her mother, the poor swan fairy was so bewildered at the extraordinary manners of her new son-in-law that she was almost speechless. Matters were in this state when King Lino's chamberlain begged for a private audience of Her Majesty, and no sooner were they alone than he told her that he feared that his master had suddenly gone mad and had fallen under a spell of some magician. "I have been lost in astonishment before," said he, "but now that he has failed to recognize the princess and no longer possesses her portrait, which he never would part from for a single instant, my amazement knows no bounds. Perhaps, madam, your fairy gifts may be able to discover the reason for this change in one whose courtesy was the talk of the kingdom." And with a low bow he took his departure. The queen stood where the chamberlain left her, thinking deeply. Suddenly her face cleared, and going to an old chest which she kept in the secret room, she drew from it a small mirror. In this mirror she could see faithfully reflected whatever she wished, and at this moment she desired above all things to behold King Lino as he really was. Ah, the chamberlain was right. It was not he who was lying on his bed snoring till the whole palace shook beneath him. No, this was her real son-in-law, the man dressed in dirty clothes and imprisoned in one of Ismenor's strongest towers, and kissing the portrait of Hermosa, which had escaped the wizard's notice, owing to the young king's having worn it for better concealment, tied amongst his hair. Calling hastily to her daughter, she bade her also look, and Hermosa had the pleasure of gazing on Lino, who was behaving exactly as she could have wished. The mirror was still in her hand when the door of the prison opened, and there entered the hideous Riquette, who, from her upraised eyes, seemed to be begging from Lino some favour which he refused to grant. Of course Hermosa and her mother could not hear her words, but from Riquette's angry face as she left the room, it was not difficult to guess what had happened. But the mirror had more to tell, for it appeared in fury at her rejection by the king. Riquette had ordered 4 strong men to scourge him till he fainted, which was done in the sight of Hermosa, who in horror dropped the mirror, and would have fallen had she not been caught by her mother. "Control yourself, my child," said the fairy. "We have need of all our wits if we are to rescue the king from the power of those wicked people. At first it is necessary to know who the man that has taken his name and face really is." Then picking up the mirror, she wished that she might behold the false lover, and the glass gave back a vision of a dirty, greasy groom, lying dressed as he was on her bed of state. So this is the trick Ismenor hoped to play on us. Well, we will have our revenge, whatever it costs us to get it. Only we must be very careful not to let him guess that he has not deceived us, for his skill in magic is greater than mine, and I shall have to be very prudent. To begin with, I must leave you, and if the false king asks why, then remember I have to settle some affairs on the borders of my kingdom. Meanwhile, be sure you treat him most politely, and arrange fates to amuse him. If he shows any sign of being suspicious, you can give him to understand that on your marriage I intend to give up the crown to your husband. And now, farewell." So saying, the Swan Fairy waved her hand, and a cloud came down and concealed her, and nobody imagined that the beautiful white cloud that was blown so rapidly across the sky was the chariot that was carrying the Swan Fairy to the tower of Ismenor. Now the tower was situated in the midst of a forest, so the Queen thought that under cover of dark trees it would be quite easy for her to drop to earth unseen. But the tower was so thoroughly enchanted that the more she tried to reach the ground, the tighter something tried to hold her back. At length, by putting forth all power she possessed, she managed to descend to the foot of the tower, and there, weak and faint as she was with her exertions, she lost no time in working her spells, and found that she could only overcome Ismenor by means of a stone from the ring of Gigas. But how was she to get this ring? For the magic book told her that Ismenor guarded it night and day among his precious treasures. However, she must get it, and in the meantime the first step was to see the royal prisoner himself. So drawing out her tablets, she wrote as follows: "The bird which brings you this letter is the Swan Fairy, mother of Hermosa, who loves you as much as you love her." And after this assurance she related the wicked plot of which she had been victim. Then quickly changing herself into a swallow, she began to fly around the tower till she discovered the window of Lino's prison. It was so high up that the bars seemed needless, especially as 4 soldiers were stationed in the passage outside. Therefore the fairy was able to enter, and even to hop on his shoulder, but he was so much occupied with gazing at the princess's portrait that it was some time before she could attract his attention. At last she gently scratched his cheek with the corner of the note, and he looked round with a start. On perceiving the swallow, he knew at once that help had come, and tearing open the letter, he wept with joy on seeing the words it contained, and asked 1,000 questions as to Hermosa, which the swallow was unable to answer, though by repeated nods she signed to him to read further. "Must I indeed pretend to wish to marry the horrible Riquet?" he cried, when he had finished. "Can I obtain the stone from the magician?" Accordingly, the next morning, when Riquet paid him her daily visit, he received her much more graciously than usual. The magician's daughter could not contain her delight at his change, and in answer to her expressions of joy, Lino told her that he had a dream by which he had learned the inconstancy of Hermosa, also that a fairy had appeared and informed him that if he wished to break the bonds which bound him to the faithless princess, and transfer his affections to the daughter of Ismenor, he must have in his possession for a day and a night a stone from the ring of Gigas, now in the possession of the magician. This news so enchanted Riquet that she flung her arms around the king's neck and embraced him tenderly, greatly to his disgust, as he would infinitely have preferred the sticks of soldiers. However, there was no help for it, and he did his best to seem pleased, till Riquet relieved him by announcing that she must lose no time in asking her father and obtaining from him the precious stone. His daughter's request came as a great surprise to Ismenor, whose suspicions were instantly excited, but think as he would, he could not see any means by which the king, so closely guarded, might have held communication with the Swan Fairy. Still, he would do nothing hastily, and hiding his dismay, he told Riquet that his only wish was to make her happy, and that as she wished so much for the stone, he would fetch it for her. And he went into the closet where all his spells were worked, and in a short time he discovered that his enemy, the Swan Fairy, was at this moment inside his palace. "So that is it," he said, smiling grimly. "Well, she shall have a stone by all means, but a stone that will turn everyone who touches it into marble." Then placing a small ruby in a box, he returned to his daughter. "Here is the talisman which will gain you the love of King Lino," he said, "but be sure you give him the box unopened, or else the stone will lose all its virtue." With a cry of joy, Riquette snatched the box from his hands and ran off to the prison, followed by her father, who, holding tightly the enchanted handkerchief, was able, unseen, to watch the working of the spell. As he expected, at the foot of the tower stood the Swamp Fairy, who had had the impudence to appear in her natural shape, waiting for the stone, which the prince was to throw to her. Eagerly she caught the box as it fell from the prince's hands, but no sooner had her fingers touched the ruby than a curious hardening came over her. Her limbs stiffened, and her tongue could hardly utter the words, "We are betrayed." "Yes, you are betrayed," cried Ismenor in a terrible voice. "And you," he continued, dragging the king to the window, "you shall turn into a parrot, and a parrot you will remain until you can persuade Hermosa to crush in your head." He had hardly finished before a blue parrot flew out into the forest, and the magician, mounting in his winged chariot, set off for the Isle of Swans, where he changed everyone into statues, exactly in the position in which he found her, not even excepting Rebot himself. Only Hermosa was spared, and her he ordered to get into his chariot beside him. In a few minutes he reached the Forest of Wonders, when the magician got down and dragged the unhappy princess out after him. "I have changed your mother to stone and your lover into a parrot," said he, "and you are to become a tree, and a tree you will remain until you have crushed the head of the person you love the best in the world. But I will leave you your mind and your memory, that your tortures may be increased 1,000-fold." Great magician as he was, Ismenor could not have invented a more terrible fate had he tried for 100 years. The hours passed wearily for the poor princess, who longed for a woodcutter's axe to put an end to her misery. How were they to be delivered from their doom? And even supposing that King Lino did fly that way, there were thousands of blue parrots in the forest, and how was she to know him or he her? As to her mother, that was too bad to think about. So being a woman, she kept on thinking. Meanwhile the blue parrot flew about the world, making friends wherever he went, till one day he entered the castle of an old wizard who had just married a beautiful young wife. Grenadine, for such was her name, led a very dull life, and was delighted to have a playfellow, so she gave him a golden cage to sleep in, and delicious fruits to eat. Only in one way did he disappoint her. He would never talk as other parrots did. "If you only knew how happy it would make me, I'm sure you would try," she was fond of saying, but the parrot did not seem to hear her. One morning, however, she left the room to gather some flowers, and the parrot, finding himself alone, hopped onto a table, picking up a pencil, wrote some verses on a piece of paper. He had just finished when he was startled by a noise, and letting fall the pencil, he flew out of the window. Now hardly had he dropped the pencil when the wizard lifted a corner of the curtain which hung over the doorway and advanced into the room. Seeing a paper on the table, he picked it up, and great was his surprise as he read, "Fair princess, to win your grace, I will hold discourse with you. Silence though were more in place than chattering like a cockatoo." "I half suspected it was enchanted," murmured the wizard to himself, and he fetched his books and searched them, and found that instead of being a parrot, the bird was really a king who had fallen under the wrath of a magician, and that magician was the man whom the wizard hated the most in the world. Eagerly he read on, seeking for some means of breaking the enchantment, and at last, to his great joy, he discovered the remedy. Then he hurried to his wife, who was lying on some cushions under the tree on which the parrot had perched, and informed her that her favourite was really the king of a great country, and that, if she would whistle for the bird, they would all go together to a certain spot in the Forest of Marvels, where I will restore him to his own shape. Only you must not be afraid or cry out, whatever I do, added he, or everything will be spoiled. The wizard's wife jumped up in an instant, so delighted was she, and began to whistle the song that the parrot loved. But as he did not wish it to be known that he had been listening to the conversation, he waited till she had turned his back, when he flew down the tree and alighted on her shoulder. Then they got into a golden boat which carried them to a clearing in the forest, where 3 tall trees stood by themselves. "I want these trees for my magic fire," he said to his wife. "Put the parrot on that branch, he will be quite safe, and go yourself a little distance. If you stay too near, you may get your head crushed in their fall." At these words the parrot suddenly remembered the prophecy of Ismenor, and held himself ready, his heart beating at the thought that in one of those trees he beheld Hermosa. Meanwhile the magician took a spade and loosened the earth of the roots of the 3 trees, so that they might fall all together. Directly the parrot observed them totter, he spread his wings and flew right under the middle one, which was the most beautiful of the 3. There was a crash, then Lino and Hermosa stood facing each other, clasped hand in hand. After the first few moments, the princess's thoughts were turned to her mother, and falling at the feet of the magician, who was smiling with the delight at the success of his plan, she implored him to help her once more, and to give the swan fairy back her proper shape. "It is not so easy," said he, "but I will try what I can do." And transporting himself to his palace to obtain a little bottle of poisoned water, he waited till nightfall, and started at once for Ismenor's tower. Of course, had Ismenor consulted his books, he would have seen what his enemy was doing, and he might have protected himself. But he had been eating and drinking too much, and had gone to bed, sleeping heavily. Changing himself into a bat, the magician flew into the room, and hiding himself in the curtains, he poured all the liquid over Ismenor's face, so that he died without a groan. At the same instant the swamp fairy became a woman again, for no magician, however powerful, can work spells which last beyond his own life. So when the swan fairy returned to her capital, she found all her courtiers waiting at the gate to receive her, and in their midst, beaming with happiness, Hermosa and King Lino. Standing behind them, though a long way off, was Raybot, but his dirty clothes had given place to clean ones, when his earnest desire was granted, and the princess made him head of her stables. And here we must bid them all farewell, feeling sure they will have many years of happiness before them after the terrible trials through which they passed. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.